Okay. All right. It's everyone see my screen okay? All right. Everyone, hello everyone. Welcome to Women's Sports International webinar on science and the policy of transgender athletes. We are very excited to have you all here today. My name is Kanae Haneshi. I am the Secretary General of Women's Sports International, and I will be the facilitator of the day. Okay. Next screen, let's see. Here we go. Okay, before we start the session, here are some housekeeping. I'm sure you all at this point are super used to this Zoom thing, but just in case, so make sure please mute yourself during the session by clicking the mute button and click CC button to turn on the live captions. And then to ask questions or make comments or show your reaction, you can use your chat feature or reaction feature as well. And we would love to know who is here today with us. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. So here is our agenda today. So we would like to start with a welcome message from our WSI President, Ms. Diane Hoffman, and then followed by our guest speaker, Ms. Joanna Harper, on science and the policy of transgender athletes. And then after the presentation, we will have the Q&A session, and then at the end, I will talk about a little bit more about the WSI and the our membership. Okay, so first we like to start with a welcome message from the WSI President Diane Hoffman. So Diane.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Morning or good evening, I guess, with the time frames all over the world. It's great that you're able to join us today. This is our webinars that we have monthly, and I think the topic today is a very interesting one and one that is on the minds of many people right now. So it's good timing for this. We hope that you learned something from today, and please feel free to ask questions and comment. This is why these webinars are here. It's purely for education and opportunity to express and be part of the issues that are facing women in sport. So welcome and enjoy.
Thank you, Diane. And okay, now it is can you see me okay? All right. It is my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Ms. Joanna Harper. So Ms. Joanna Harper is the visiting fellow for transgender athletic performance at the Loughborough University in England, and the PhD researcher at the university, studying the performance of transgender athletes. Ms. Harper co-authors a systemic review of hormone-based changes in non-athletic transgender women, published in the BJSM. Ms. Harper published the first peer-reviewed study examining the performance of transgender athletes. She is also the author of the book Sporting Gender: The History, Science, and Story of Transgender and Intersex Athletes. Ms. Harper has worked closely with several international and national sports governing bodies concerning LGBT policy for transgender and intersex athletes. So please join me to welcome today's guest speaker, Ms. Joanna Harper.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my slides? And in full screen? Good? Okay. So, as I said, I'll be talking about the science and policy of transgender athletes, but I'd like to start with a few basics first. I'd like to first introduce the idea that sex and gender are two different things. Sex is biology and gender is sociology, but it's not quite that simple because gender is partly biological and sex is partly sociological. In specific, if we look at the biology of sex, the start for all of the biological sexual characteristics are the genetic coding that we have in each and every chromosome. Most people have either an XX or an XY pair of chromosomes, but some people have different combinations. In turn, the chromosome pattern sets hormone levels for our body and determines whether we produce large gametes or ovaries or small gametes or sperm. And the sex hormone levels in turn also regulate things like our gamete production and internal and external genitalia. And it's certainly possible for somebody to have external genitalia that appear male or female with internal genitalia that appear differently. Also, our sexual orientation and gender identity are probably coded in our genetics as well, which then makes the idea of gender biological. And if sexual orientation also is genetic, then that too is a characteristic of biology. So if gender is indeed at least partly biological, then then we need to look at it a little differently than if it's purely sociological. And there have been a great many ideas recently that talk about something other than a gender binary or simple male-female division. And I've listed some of them here, but this sort of implies a one-dimensional continuum between male and female. And I'd actually like to suggest something a little more complicated, and that's a two-dimensional graph to represent gender. And along the bottom of that graph, we could have various aspects of gender, like assigned gender, social gender, legal gender, and something that I like to call athletic gender or gender for the purpose of sport. And these could all be different in an individual. And this graph more or less represents me. I was assigned male at birth. My social gender is female. My Canadian passport says I'm non-binary. So what does all that mean for what category I should compete in sports? And I would say not very much. I would say when we determine the athletic gender of somebody or the category of sports performance, then we should use a biomarker or biomarkers that are important to differentiate male athletes from female athletes and are mostly dimorphic. While I use this term athletic gender, others have spoken about similar ideas. Duke Law professor Dorian Coleman speaks of sports sex, and Dorian and I are basically speaking about the same thing. And so this idea is not unique to me, but it is one of the things that I talk about. And so let's move on to looking at transgender athletes, and in particular transgender female athletes. There are a number of people who refer to trans women as biological males and suggest that the presence of trans women in women's sports represents an intolerable unfairness, or perhaps even more hyperbolically, the end of women's sports. Well, I would probably suggest something a little tamer than that. And I would suggest that if we look at transgender athletes, I think the first thing we should recognize is that the gender identity posed by someone who is transgender is sincere, whether that person is athletic or not. and nobody would transition for sports. And let me give you an example of one of the athletes in my study. Shortly after she started hormone therapy, her wife left her, took their child. Her parents disowned her. She was so distraught by this that she attempted suicide not once, but twice. Who would do this for sports? Second thing, I would suggest that philosophically, we should think of trans women as a special subcategory of all women, but a physiologically distinct subcategory, as opposed to men who think they are women. And let's be very clear, the physiological differences between trans women and cisgender or typical women are important for sport. However, this philosophy would have you think of trans women a little differently. If you think of trans women as men invading women's sports, then each and every successful trans woman becomes an affront. If we think of trans women as a distinct subcategory of all women, then I would suggest that it is reasonable to have some trans women be successful in women's sports, as long as trans women aren't overrepresented. Another thing I would say is that people have said, well, trans women shouldn't be in women's sports because hormone therapy doesn't eliminate all advantages. And I would say it doesn't have to. I would say that hormone therapy, while it doesn't eliminate all the advantages, it does mitigate advantages. And hopefully it mitigates advantages enough to have meaningful competition between trans women and cis women. And let me explain a little bit more what I mean by that. As I said, trans women have advantages even after hormone therapy over cis women, but we allow advantage in sport. And in particular, left-handed athletes have advantages over right-handed athletes in many sports. It's perhaps most noticeable in fencing, where 40% of elite fencers are left-handed versus 10% of the population. But we don't separate left-handed fencers and right-handed fencers into two categories. We have them compete against one another, despite the advantages that left-handed fencers have. However, we don't let heavyweight boxers get in the ring with flyweight boxers. And here's the difference. The advantages that heavyweight boxers have over flyweight boxers are so large that the flyweight boxer will never win, no matter how good that boxer is, how hard that boxer trains, and how much that boxer wants to win. The size difference is always the only thing that matters. In fencing, although left-handers have noticeable advantages in the sport, right-handers can and do win 60% of the time. And so I refer to this as meaningful sport. And once again, this isn't uniquely my idea. It comes from a book by Thomas Murray called Good Sport, and it's a terrific read. And he talks about this idea of meaningful sport, among other things, in the book. So the question isn't, do trans women have advantages, but can we have meaningful competition between trans women and cis women? And one way, as I alluded to earlier, is to look at the representation of trans women. And trans women are underrepresented at all levels of sport. the most significant population study that we could look at are NCAA sports. There are more than 200,000 women competing annually in all of the various NCAA categories and institutions. 11 years ago, the NCAA allowed trans women who had been on gender-affirming hormone therapy for at least 1 year to compete in women's sport. Trans people make up approximately 1% of the total population. So that would mean roughly 2,000 trans women if trans women were equally represented in NCAA sports, and certainly at least 1,000. And we don't know the exact number of trans women competing in the NCAA, but given all the information that I have, it's pretty clear that there are only a handful annually, certainly fewer than 50 competing in women's category. 11 years, that's 2 generations of collegiate athletes have come and gone since the NCAA began allowing them to compete. So it's pretty clear that in this huge population base, trans women are still greatly underrepresented. Let's look a little higher in the food chain. At the Olympics, 5,000 women competed in the Tokyo Olympics. Again, equal representation of trans women would be 30 to 50. And yet there's a great fuss was made because we knew that one trans woman, Laurel Hubbard from New Zealand, was competing. Chelsea Wolfe, a BMX rider from the United States, was named as an alternate. There were rumors that there was another one, but still, even if there was a second trans athlete competing and one as an alternate, it still falls far, far short of equal representation. And this was the first Olympics that there were even any trans women. So, and the IOC first allowed trans women in 2004. So once again, trans women are underrepresented even at the highest levels of sport. But what I really want to talk about is the science behind trans athletes. The very first paper published to say anything much about the science specifically relating to transgender athletes was mine in 2015. It was a small study. It was a retrospective look at race times from 8 transgender women runners. Collectively, they all got at least 10% slower, using a method used by World Masters Athletics called age grade. The trans women put up very similar age grades, even though they got slower. The graph at the bottom shows that most of the times got slower, and that's the times are listed in the dots. The age grade change is listed in the numbers, and you can see the numbers, while they're not all 0, they do hover around that, and that indicates an age grade equivalence. Look, this is a really small study, and based on in a retrospective look, by any sort of normal standards, this study should not have created much of a stir at all, but it was the very first paper published by anyone looking at performance of trans athletes. And so I suddenly found myself in the position of having more published data than all the universities in all the world. And that led to me going to Loughborough University in England. And I'll talk shortly about some of our studies. The first thing that I'd like to mention is that we put out a systematic review of studies of changes in hormone therapy on non-athletic trans women in 2001. Emma Hilton and Tommy Lundberg did a similar review on virtually the same studies. Around the same time, Dr. Roberts and company put out an observational study of fitness tests in transgender service personnel. And I'd like to look at those 3 studies. And since I was the first author of one, we'll start with ours. 2 important conclusions from our paper. One was that hemoglobin levels in trans women on hormone therapy went from male to female values within 4 months of starting hormone therapy. And while sports performance is multifactorial, hemoglobin is probably the single most important factor in endurance sport performance. It's why endurance athletes go to altitude to train. It's why they dope with EPO to boost the red blood cell content and increase their aerobic capacity. In contrast to this rapid and complete change in hemoglobin, trans women did lose strength, but not nearly to female norms. And these strength factors did not reduce to female norms even after 36 months. It should be noted that these studies are on non-athletic trans women and not on athletes. And they should have limited amount to say, but again, given the paucity of published data on trans athletes, these are substantially important. The Hilton and Lundberg study focused very much on the strength changes. One of the things they noted was that most of these papers that we looked at that looked at strength, and not all of the papers did, but those that did usually measured hand grip strength. And Hilton and Lundberg pointed out that typical men have 57% greater hand strength than typical women. However, the same studies showed that trans women, even before starting hormone therapy, had a 10 to 14% lower grip strength than cisgender men. And that's important because in this non-athletic population, we're not starting from the same place. So even though the loss of strength wasn't that large, the overall result, as Hilton and Lundberg pointed out, was that the trans women maintained a 17% grip strength advantage over the cisgender women. And while that may seem like a fairly substantial advantage, it's less than 1/3 of the advantage that cisgender men have over cisgender women. I'd like to move on and look at the Roberts et al. Study. They looked at 3 fitness tests. The first one was a 1.5-mile run, and the time on the left is in seconds, and the results on the bottom are the male controls or cisgender males. On the top are the female controls or cisgender females. Trans men in the service personnel are in blue and trans women are in red. The trans women lost 12% of their speed over the first year to 2 of hormone therapy, but then got a little faster, 3% faster in the last year of the study. And the result was that they didn't lose all of their speed advantage. The trans men, on the other hand, went from starting from the same position as the cisgender women and got faster to where they were equally as fast as the cisgender men. If we look at the number of push-ups per minute, the trans women started with a 31% advantage over the cisgender women. Again, this is the red over the dotted line on the bottom. And with 2+ years of hormone therapy, that advantage completely went away. The trans men went from roughly the cis female to the cis male levels of number of push-ups per minute. Lastly, sit-ups per minute. The same thing with the trans women. They went from typical male to typical female values. Interesting enough, the trans men by the end of the study actually outperformed the cis men in the number of sit-ups per minute. So this is at least one area where trans men were outperforming cis men. It doesn't mean that trans men will be taking over men's sport anytime soon. And the results of this study are interesting because they're almost the opposite of the things that we've found. They found a complete resolution in the advantage of number of push-ups per minute, which is very much a strength-oriented endeavor, but not an endurance performance endeavor. And we kind of found the opposite. And so I think that shows you just where we are overall in this category, that the data are inconclusive at this point. So let me talk about what we're doing at Loughborough. We have 3 studies. We have longitudinal and cross-sectional lab studies where we look at the performance of trans athletes in the sports lab, and an online observational study. Let me start with the online observational study. We're trying to look at the performance before and after gender-affirming hormone therapy in select sports, specifically so-called centimeter gram second or CGS sports, such as athletics or weightlifting or track cycling or swimming, where it's easy to measure results using just numbers. We have data from 15 athletes, 1 trans man and 14 trans women. One of the most important things we found in the study, we have data from hormone data in addition to competition results. And the trans women in the study all went from typical female or typical male values of testosterone. On the right, you can see they went from 13 to 25 nanomoles per liter, to where the average after sufficient length of hormone therapy got down to about 1 nanomole per liter. And this value is 2.1 nanomoles per liter, which is roughly the top end of the female range. And so you can see that all of the points, save one, after sufficient hormone therapy, were well under that value. Now, the time taken to get down to typical female values ranged from a few days to several months, depending on just how aggressive the anti-androgen agents were. But that didn't have anything to do with sports. That had to do with how conservative or aggressive their physicians prescribed their hormone therapy. It also, the resulting hormone levels didn't have anything to do with the testosterone limit imposed by their sporting federations. Some of these athletes were in a sport where they were required to have testosterone below 10, some below 5, and this is the 10 line, and this is the 5, and one is in a sport where they're now required to have testosterone below 2.5, and one didn't have any requirement at all. And yet they all came down to 1 nanomole per liter. And that shows, again, one of the things I said early on, trans women don't transition for sports. We transition to be more like other women, so we bring our testosterone down to the same levels as other women. It does, however, happen that these testosterone changes do have an impact on sports. That the trans women, the 14 trans women in various sports, lost between 80 and 20% of their performance. Most of these women were in endurance sports, but not all. 9 of the 15 women had before and after performances in the sport of athletics. And again, we used age grade formula to look at their results, and very similar age grade results among the 9 women collectively. That the trans man in the study is a power lifter. Powerlifting is a sport that combines 3 lifts, the squat, the deadlift, and the bench press. And he very gradually gained over 3 years, 34% of his weight lifted in those combined events. The most important study that we're doing is a longitudinal study. And what we attempt to do with that is to get trans athletes into the sports lab before they start gender affirming hormone therapy. And we measure their size, strength, power, aerobic capacity. Additionally, we get blood and muscle biopsy. We do things like ultrasound of the heart. And the goal is to do that before hormone therapy and every 3 months for at least 24 months. That study has been greatly affected by the global pandemic, but at this point we have one athlete with more than 12 months of hormone therapy and testing. She's an elite cyclist, and her losses, the most important testing for her is the power that she generates on the bike and her peak oxygen capacity, or VO2 max. She lost about 15% of her power and 10% of her VO2 max. And those are very similar to the differences between male and female cyclists. So she has lost, in cycling, she's lost enough of her performance that she is, virtually the same loss as the difference between male and female. Unlike most of the studies in the non-athletic cohort that we reviewed, we used 4 different strength measures: 2 upper body, bench press, and hand grip strength, 2 lower body, leg extension, and counter movement jump. In 3 of those 4 tests, there's been significant losses in strength. But in 3 of those 4 tests, the strength loss is not of the same order as the strength difference between men and women. For instance, this cyclist lost 20% on her bench press, but the difference in upper body strength between men and women is of the order of 50%. So despite the fact that she has certainly, by any reasonable measure, maintained some strength advantage, in terms of her ability to cycle, 12 months of hormone therapy has brought her to a very similar level among women as to where she was among men. The last study that we're doing is a cross-sectional study. Again, we try to bring trans athletes into the sports lab, but this time only once after they've been on hormone therapy for at least a year and are competing in women's sports. Again, we measure size, strength, speed, stamina. We get blood draw, and our goal is to get 12 to 15 trans women into the lab and match them up with 12 to 15 typical women in the same sport. At this point, we have 8 trans women that we've studied and 1 cis woman. I have 4 other trans women lined up to study, and hopefully we can get 3 more by the end of the year. And very soon I'm going to switch my attention to mostly getting the cisgender women to match up. And once we have data from both trans women and cis women, then we can make some meaningful comparisons. So look, we've made a great start at Loughborough University, but the data that we gather, it will never be robust. The numbers won't be large enough from a single institution, nor can you ultimately rely on data from just one place. Before we can have robust data, we're going to need multicentric, multinational studies. And there are a number of obstacles to these studies, but I do think that these studies can take place, and it's important that they do so. And I'm hopeful that in another year or so, I can make an announcement about a major step forward in that. But for now, those sort of multicentric studies aren't happening. So what do sports federations do now, given the paucity of data and that the data don't all correspond? Well, what I would suggest is that any document created by a sports policy, sports governing body currently be considered a living document, something that will be adjusted as time goes on, should be reviewed regularly. As we get more and better data, hopefully we can create we can create better policy, or we can inform better policy. But overall, I would suggest a two-tier approach. I think that when we look at recreational sports, when we talk about prepubescent athletes, where we're talking about sport that isn't hugely competitive, or where there's no money, or nothing that's largely at stake, we should be focusing on inclusion. Trans people are a very marginalized population, and everybody gains from participating in sport. And so when we look at recreational sports, we should try to get more trans people in. And there are a number of barriers for that. Uniforms, acceptance by other athletes, changing rooms, all these barriers. But we need to get more trans people in sports. However, once we get to high-level sports, and especially at international level sports, it is entirely appropriate to put restrictions on trans women in particular. I would suggest that at a minimum, we should be requiring trans women to reduce testosterone to female values before competing in women's sports, and on a sport-by-sport basis, other restrictions may be important. International Volleyball Federation restricts each national team to one trans woman volleyball player, and I don't think that's unreasonable. Now, no trans woman has ever been named to her nation's volleyball team, so this restriction by the Volleyball Federation hasn't actually come into place yet, and may never. But again, I don't think that this is an unreasonable restriction. So in conclusion, I would say we are in early days of research. Certainly the hormone therapy affects performance, and I would preach that we should be using science over policy. We should be engaging in rational discourse rather than shouting hyperbole. And hopefully as we get more data, that will mean better policy. I have a book out if you want more information. It's called Sporting Gender, and there's a picture of it. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge that the research that we're doing at Loughborough requires a big team, and it's not just me, and I'm very grateful for all the support at the university. Thank you very much.
Hey, well, Ms. Joanna Harper, thank you so much for informative presentation, educational informative presentation. I was just looking at the screen, just taking a note, like, oh, okay, so it was like very informative and then helpful information, especially what is going on in the internationally as well. So now we are moving into the Q&A session. So I like to open up to the floor to see if anyone has a question. Feel free to unmute yourself, maybe introduce yourself, before your question. So we, then go in your questions. So who would you like to start? I know it's always the first one is a difficult goal, but does anyone would like to start here with questions?
Someone has their hand up.
Someone with a hand up.
It's me. Can I?
Yes, please.
Joanna, thank you. That was really, really interesting and great job. One of the things that, you had to be very selective about what you talked about because it's a short time and all. But here in the States, I would say that one of the bits of hyperbole that you were talking about has to do with the timing of transition and a kind of like a big deal made, not casting aspersions on the concept, but if someone starts their transition post-puberty, that you can't wipe out the advantages and that sort of thing. Maybe it's too complicated to get into, but that was one thing I wondered if you had any sense that you could say in a sentence or two about whether that, how to deal with that if you're in a position where you're in a governing body trying to figure out how to respond to the kind of like the wild environment that we're in.
So I do believe I did talk about that. I did say that trans women do have maintained advantages, and that the advantages that they gain through puberty are not eliminated. They are mitigated, but not eliminated with hormone therapy. I also showed you, I think, a pretty important example of a cyclist who, while she maintained clear upper body strength advantage, her cycling performance had deteriorated to the point where, where her loss of cycling power and her loss of VO2, which are the most important factors for cycling, were comparable to the differences between male and female athletes. So sports performance is multifactorial. And just because trans women do maintain some advantages doesn't mean that they're going to be taking over sports or that it's unfair necessarily to have them compete. And I certainly acknowledge, and I did in the talk, that trans women do maintain advantages even after hormone therapy.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Sarah, yes, please.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I think it's really helped me to take a look at, the advantages and the mitigation. And that's really clarified a lot about biological advantage. One of the things I was really interested in is, the kind of something that I deal with on a regular basis with my athletes as a sports psychologist is menstruation. And that becomes a big part of performance in terms of, an athlete's performance during menstruation, and because of the cycle is quite up and down. Their moods are up and down. Would you say that, or do you have any evidence or any kind of input in terms of how a trans female athlete, a trans woman or female athlete would be compared in that sense of, menstruation and that kind of experiences that female typically have in sport?
So trans women certainly don't menstruate, but in terms of psychological challenges, trans people in general have much greater psychological challenges than cisgender people. The attempted suicide rate among trans people is 40%. The depression rate suffered by trans people is much, much greater than that of cisgender people. So while trans women certainly don't suffer with menstruation, with the cycle, with the ups and downs in performance that come with that, they have their own psychological problems that it's difficult to compare one person's psychological problems to another, but I would think, given a 40% attempted suicide rate, I think, we certainly shouldn't minimize the psychological problems that trans people face.
Thank you for that, Joanna. That really helps. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You can also type the question in the chat if that's easier for you. Yes, please.
Wait,
Caroline?
Guylaine,
Sorry, I'm sorry.
French,
Please.
French Canadian. No, that's okay. I used to say you can call me Nancy. It's my
Nancy.
sister's name, so much easier. So I'm a professor at Laval University, and one of my area of research is on LGBTQ plus athletes and coaches. One of the challenge that, and the question I have is that, when we talk about advantages in sport, I mean, it's everywhere. Sport is unfair. Like, I was a basketball player. Unfortunately, I'm only 5'8", and I was so, I wish I would have been 6'6", but that was not the case. So that was unfair. I was not big enough, so I couldn't go as far as I would have wished. So this is where I'm struggling a lot, because, and I appreciate, Joanna, that you really make the difference between very high performance sport compared to all the rest, where we have probably 95% of our athletes and young athletes, and I think everyone should be allowed to play sport, whatever. But even if we talk about the high performance level, how do you, it's always, we always talk about that advantages, but they're everywhere. So you had that great example with the fencers. So where, and it's always when it comes to women's sports that people are struggling with that. It's like you cannot have a very successful woman athlete because you will be suspicious that there's probably something wrong. Like, imagine Michael Phelps being a woman. Oh my God, that would be suspicious. Like, it's like we're still struggling I think as a society to see very great women athletes being super strong, super fast, etc. So where do you, or how do you decide that advantage is unfair compared to all the others advantages that we see everywhere in sport, and it's just for trans women, like you did when you showed the different results that you have. We saw that for some trans men, it was an advantage that because they are taking hormones, testosterone in particular, but nobody talks about those because, it was a woman, she was a woman before, so it's not a problem. But so I would just like to hear you about that, like where do we draw that line, and we are still I think targeting women again. So I'll stop there because I could talk forever, but thanks.
So first, let me say that I too am Canadian, and my mother is of French Canadian stock. Her maiden name is Desjardins, and but I'm from Ontario originally. But it's certainly true that sports are unfair. Sports are inherently unfair. But when we subdivide sports into categories, we do so with the acknowledgement that if we don't subdivide into categories, then we can't have meaningful competition for people. And I gave the example of a small boxer. A small boxer can't possibly win. And women in almost any sport aren't going to be able to win Olympic gold medals, win professional sports contracts, unless we have a women's category. So as an example, in the last year's Olympics, Faith Kipyegon set an Olympic record. in the women's 1500, but she was 12% slower than the men's winner, Jakob Ingebrigtsen from Norway. But beyond that, she wouldn't even qualify to get in the Olympics. She's nowhere near that if there wasn't a women's division. And so it's a little disingenuine to say, well, Michael Phelps has advantages because he has advantages competing against other men. And so we need to look at the advantages between men and women. And what happens is that when a male goes through puberty, the testosterone increase is such that the physical attributes gained by that person are so substantial that in most sports, we can't have meaningful competition between male athletes and female athletes. And so there is a reason to at least be concerned about trans women who've gone through hormone therapy, or sorry, have gone through a male type puberty. And then that's the last thing a trans woman wants to do. And it was the worst thing that ever happened in my life. But it is important to acknowledge that going through that the puberty that I detested did give me advantages over other women. Now, as you say, in recreational sport, I don't think we should be very concerned about it, but in upper levels of sport, it is something we should be concerned about. And, so the question is, can hormone therapy reduce those advantages to the point where we can have meaningful competition between trans women and cis women? So far the population studies would indicate yes. The science studies, are not quite as unequivocal, but I do think that we do need to understand that yes, sports are inherently unfair, but if we don't want raw biology undermining the things that we try to measure, we try to celebrate in sports, things like training and heart and determination and courage, then we need a women's category, and we need to be careful about who gets into that category. And so I certainly acknowledge that the biological science that differentiates male athletes and female athletes, and it is reasonable to have some concern about trans women who've gone through male puberty, but that doesn't mean that trans women should be categorically denied a place in women's sports because they've gone through hormone therapy. It's really a complex and difficult question, but I do think we do need to acknowledge the biology. And I'm sorry you didn't grow taller.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, I think that the problem is not to include trans women in sport. It's the system itself that is binary. I think that's the problem. So, yeah.
And, at recreational levels of sport, we don't need to have a binary system. We can do all sorts of creative things when it comes to recreational sport. And I would certainly urge sports to look beyond. A sport like ultimate frisbee, for instance, is inherently co-ed, has men and women on the field at the same time. There are other things that can be done, but at elite levels of sport, we need to have a women's category if we want women succeeding, and we need to be careful about who gets in.
Thank you. I also think that, like the definition of elite sports is different from, people to people. And also like definition of perception of meaningful competition is different too. so like, yeah, for me, even NCAA should be like more considered to like, inclusiveness. But then for some people, NCAA sports might be considered as elite sports. So, I think I think that gets harder. So when you talk about meaningful competition too, like what does that mean?
It is hard to draw that line and to say, at what point do we need to become more concerned? But I would say, rather than a firm line, we should perhaps have, a gradient that as we get higher up, we tend to look at this more closely. And that's not an exact thing, but yeah. And how do you decide if competition is meaningful? Well, I think population studies can help, but I also think looking at the physical attributes can help, and seeing how people perform on the playing field. So I think there's a number of things that go into it, and it's not straightforward, and this is not an easy question, and I'm not saying I have easy answers.
Totally agree. There's one comment on the chat from Hope. Her question is around the policy concerning hormonal therapy, especially in poor societies. Is it affordable? Or what does it mean to those that can afford but want to participate?
So, hormone therapy itself is not very expensive, depending on which agents you use. Some of the anti-androgen agents are significantly more expensive than others. And for trans men, injecting testosterone can be a little more expensive. But if we're talking about trans women, you can have fairly reasonable hormone therapy alternates or options, rather, that are pretty inexpensive. They're not free, but the question of, does your insurance cover them, is depends on where in the world you live, and the truth is that in many parts of the world, there is no support whatsoever for trans people. And does that play into a fact? Yeah, of course. But again, if we're talking about elite sport, I do think it is incumbent upon us to have this meaningful competition, and I do think it requires trans women to be on hormone therapy. And if they are a potential elite athlete and they are from a poorer country, hopefully they would get support from a sports federation if that sports federation wanted them to compete. And in truth, in most of these countries, trans women aren't welcome in elite sports anyway. But yeah, there's not equal access around the world to hormone therapy.
Thank you. Yes, Carol.
I just want to try to follow up quickly. Joanna, on the web, or are there any international foundations or anything created as yet? This is a real ignorance question. I'm just wondering, relative to Hope's question, is there any way that a person who's kind of in an isolated situation may have access only through the web or something? Is there any place to gain some kind of guidance? And maybe that just doesn't exist. Maybe that's one of the things we need to try to create. I'm sure.
When you say guidance, you mean social guidance to
like medical, medical or answering medical questions, or how to have a connection to a physician or someone who might be able to have input into initiating hormone therapy?
There are, I don't like have the URLs on the top of my head or anything, but there are some places where there are trans-centric spaces on the internet, and certainly hormone therapy is one of the major discussion points on most of these sites.
Maybe that's something that WSI could look into about making some of some information more public after.
Oh, yeah, sure. Especially for like transgender athletes, yes, okay. Thank you very much. So once again, thank you, Miss Joanna Harper, for providing us great information, interesting, great information. So before you go on, I like to talk a little bit about WSI and the membership. So stay tuned right there. Okay, so WSI is committed to ensure girls and women have an equal opportunity to engage in, enjoy, and benefit from participating in sports and physical activity. So through networking, collaboration, and varied research-based information, WSI educates and advocates for positive change for girls and women's equality in sports. So if you go to our website, www.womensportsinternational.org, which is going to be in the next web page, and then join us as a member. So on the very first page, you can click on it, and then you can guide through as a member, guide through how you become a member of WSI, and then you can be in the network of the WSI. So thank you everyone again for attending the WSI webinar. So thank you for once again for today's guest speaker, Ms. Joanna Harper, and thank you everyone for participating and attending for the webinar today. So this is our website, and then today's recording will be available on our website, and it's through YouTube, right? Yes. So you can always go back and then watch the recording as well. Once again, thank you everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day, or have a wonderful night or morning. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.